Hello and welcome to a new episode of our program, The World Today. I'm Yasmin Bakir. I'll be joining you with my guest here in studio to shed more light on the latest developments happening in Egypt and around the world. I'm very much delighted to have joining me Madam Yusra Shar'awi, who's the Deputy Head of the Foreign Affairs Desk at Al Ahram Daily newspaper. Thank you very much for joining us, Madam. Let's start by first discussing about how you see the current visit by the Spanish Defense Minister to Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. What does this reflect on the relationship between both Spain and Egypt? We do know last year President al-Sisi had visited Spain and he had laid a solid ground on the relationships and the terms between both countries. How do you see this?
Well, to review this visit, we have to tackle it on two levels. First, we have to tackle it within the new foreign policy stated by Egypt in the post era of the 30th of June. We are talking about a multipolar foreign policy. Egypt is addressing the whole world and not just certain circles of allies. It's broadening the horizon now in terms of politics, of economic cooperation, and of most importantly, defense and security cooperation as well. And back, we are seeing a more maturing reaction by the world toward this multipolar foreign policy adopted by Egypt.
Multipolar meaning that equally the relationship is of mutual interest equally with the rest of the world.
Equally, and expanding the scope of the foreign affairs much more. We are seeing more cooperation between Europe in general, not just Spain and Egypt, in more than one arena. And this current visit by the Spanish defense minister can be reviewed in this scope, that we are talking about more cooperation, especially in terms of security, on the security level.
Yes. We're going to move to another story, and of course, Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry, who is taking part today in the UN Security Council and General Assembly session as part of his 3-day visit to New York, and shortly will be cutting off live on a transmission from New York, where we see the speech given by the Foreign Minister of Egypt. It's a very important step. It's definitely going to be reflecting a lot about the position of Egypt. There are, high number of on the agenda of issues that will be tackled regarding the Palestinian cause, combating terrorism, the African issues. How do you expect this visit to turn out?
As you have described it, this was a huge diplomatic leap for Egypt. Now, Egypt is, as everyone knows, is having not a non-permanent seat at the Security Council for 2 years. This is a very huge leap for Egypt, and we are talking a very serious, important, and constructive agenda that Egypt is starting its period in the Security Council with. We are talking about focusing on, Mr. Sameh Shoukry will be discussing today in New York, or the coming few days, mainly a dialogue with ideological groups, with a focus on Islamic, with a focus on Islamic extremist organizations, and this is very important to have a cooperative stance between most of the country members in the United Nations and the Security Council of how to tackle the dialogue with such entities, how to construct a very up-to-date dialogue, away from the traditional one of how to deal with them.
Which wasn't proven successful at all, actually.
No.
Yes, upon Egypt's initiative, it is taking the presidency over right now of the current UN Security Council session. And what gains can Egypt try to benefit to the maximum from this?
Actually,
a chance to play a vital role, or not just as Egypt, but as the Arab region in general.
Mr. Sameh Shoukry will be will have a meeting with a number of the Arab countries represented in the United Nations to discuss the major Arab issues that have to be tackled and have a spot of light on it in the coming few months and years. And this is actually a very constructive step, because now Egypt is taking the lead as a permanent Arab country in the Security Council. Now, it starts with a dialogue with the Arab, within the Arab community itself of nations. We are trying to have a sort of a solid stance of what comes first and what are the priorities.
Yes.
And this will help not just Egypt, as you mentioned, but the whole Arab
Yes, I was
countries.
thinking also about the African region, because you know, there's no doubt that we must say that it's the African countries' support that voted for Egypt
that have helped
to be winning this non-permanent seat in the UN Security Council. With the various issues and problems and conflicts that the African region is facing, how far can Egypt succeed in resolving these crucial problems, namely poverty, health concerns, empowering women, even so many files? So definitely there's a lot of burden on Egypt and a huge responsibility put on it. How do you see Egypt taking this role?
If we take a close look and review the major items on Mr. Sameh Shoukry agenda, we will find them cross-roading, okay, between the Arab concerns and the African concerns, and this must be, yani, it's assumable. Because we are talking about, for example, one of the major items on Mr. Sameh Shoukry agenda is to discuss the development of the United Nations rules in terms of peacekeeping. And this is especially with the growing concerns and problems in North Africa and in the Middle East, with the post-Arab Spring problems we are currently seeing. We are talking about the United Nations is trying to play a role, but it's actually in some way failing. Okay, so one of the major issues we are talking about peacekeeping abilities, skills, and how to develop them, and how to develop the infrastructures of the United Nations in these areas. This is not just about the Arab world, but more of for the African states and the concerns with. The dialogue and the talking with the ideological groups, especially the Islamic extremist militants or groups, organizations, is again one of the cross-roading issues between the Arab world and Africa.
Yes, and the region. I mean, it's been touching all of Europe. I mean, the Paris and Brussels attacks, definitely this is of main concern. That's why I want to ask you here about, I mean, Egypt is not just going to be playing an ordinary role or just filling in an ordinary seat. It's going to be taking concrete decisions and is going to lift up certain recommendations. How do you see the division between the veto power, world powers who are going to be voting for and against the outcome of this assembly? Very clearly here I'm talking about the Russian-American interests in terms of where Egypt lies in the assembly.
Yeah. Well, Egypt that we have today is more present on the international arena in a more of not just acting, but really, really acting and trying to present a different agenda. And we have lots of dynamics going on in the Middle East and the Arab world and Africa, and Russia on one hand and the United States on the other is involved. And we are talking about Egypt is trying to balance its alliance between or its relations and ties between Russia on one hand and the United States on the other. And Egypt is not actually acting on its own. As I mentioned, Mr. Sameh Shoukry is trying to have a solid stance between the stance that involves most of the Arab nations inside the United Nations. This has to be taken in consideration, that Egypt is not speaking for its own, it's speaking for the Arab world, it's speaking for the African countries as well, and this will give it will give Egypt's stance more of a strategic importance and more of strategic influence, and this has to be taken in consideration. And I think Egypt has been handling this delicate issue of balancing the ties between Russia
and that's why I want to ask you briefly before we move to another story, but how do you evaluate the performance of Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry? I mean, obviously speaking, Egypt is very successful in choosing its foreign minister. He's doing a very ultimate effort, and you know, he's got this way about how he can handle things. The statements coming out of the foreign minister are always well studied, well balanced, direct messages that are being delivered, you know, across different occasions. Regarding the foreign policy of Egypt, seems to be doing a better job than others. How do you see that?
Mr. Sameh Shoukry is presenting the new Egypt that has to be present, that has to be in action, that has to be involved with most of the hot issues we have out there: terrorism, peacekeeping, the war in Syria, or the civil the civil war in Syria, which is actually not that civil. And so he is trying to present a new vision of Egypt. It's more there. It has a stance, and it will speak for its own and for others as well if needed.
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned Syria, because that's our next story, of course, that we'd want to go and dive more in depth concerning it. Now, the United States have tried to move past the localized short-term ceasefire in Syria, announcing that enduring nationwide truce would be restored. Now, yet the new approach was immediately called into doubt as Syria's military extended only a local ceasefire in the hard-hit area of Aleppo by 48 hours. Now, the situation, I mean, I don't know if you probably noticed, the media suddenly, and social media just rose up and, save Aleppo, save Syria, and people are dying, and as if it's just a last week occurrence, and it's not been ongoing for 5 years.
Yeah.
How do you see that from a political analysis perspective?
Yeah, the fact that again, it's power of social media, when to spot, to direct a spot on the event, and when to withdraw it, or when that maybe one day Syria is all in the, we are talking about Syria all the time, and one day something else is coming and overtaking the Syrian concerns. The issue is, the problem with the Syrian cause is that we have a serious effort going on in the frame of Geneva negotiations, and we have some steps, we can call them positive, that have been taken in ground in terms of the I know weak but still ceasefires that were usually broken. The problem with
and usually did not include al-Nusra Front and Daesh, which is all what the story is about in Syria.
This is the problem. This is the problem, that not every party that has to be included in the negotiations are actually in there, and the fact that it is not all inclusive is weakening
Is that really the point, or is it the fact that there are no negotiations that will be undergoing without the step down of Bashar al-Assad? Well,
the problem with
I mean, I'm talking between the government and the opposition.
The opposition coalition is, again, the fact that Bashar al-Assad will be kept in his position, and we will just talk about a national government that will have the transitional period. And with Bashar al-Assad is the fact of talking about pushing him outside of the frame, and then just start to form a new government and a new maybe a more democratic system inside Syria. The issue is with the negotiation, it has to handle the two points of view and make a sort of compromise, which seems so far very difficult to do, even with the recent incidents in Aleppo. And we have seen how the Russian and the American reactions were, well, disappointing to some extent, that they were not actually taking a firm, and which is expected as well, where they were not actually taking a firm stand against all of this.
Yes, but they're not taking a firm stand, but isn't it seeming to be more like an opposing stand between Russia and the United States over Syria?
It has been the same all the time, but again, this is harming the
negotiation. But not for the benefit of the negotiations of the people, of course, because it's only the civilians that are always paying the cost and the price for this. And that's why I want to ask you, I mean, people are talking about refugees and millions of Syrians who have, been stranded, and humanitarian crisis that is eventually really going into its serious curve in Syria now due to the fighting that is going between different parties. Now it's become so complicated, you don't know who's fighting who in Syria. How long do you think this is going to take? Because some people are talking about 10 to 20 years.
With the refugee issue, I think that the refugee issue will outlive the crisis itself, because it's the consequences of the refugee issue is that we are talking about that it has tested the international community, and the international community failed in more than one front. First, United Nations.
Right, it wasn't waiting for Syria to be tested on. I mean, we've seen crises in other nations before.
Yes, but this one was one of the most catastrophic.
Yes.
And it hit the fact that it's heading to, the Arab world tried its best to handle the refugee flow. The problem with the Arab world is now Arab countries are actually going through lots of difficulties economically and politically, and transitional periods that are tough in their own. So we are talking about flows heading to the Europe, to Europe and to the West in general. The problem was that the United Nations, all the international organizations that have to stand and to handle the refugee issue failed.
Yes.
Yeah, it has been proven in a catastrophic way, in that we have reached with the Syrian issue this point that, stop, we have to rearrange everything. We have to start from the infrastructure. We have to review the funds. We have to review the international responsibility, the humanitarian responsibility for this. And the second level is actually the hosting countries. We are talking about here Europe. We are talking about economic.
Jordan, there is more than 500,000 refugees in Al-Zatari camp in Jordan.
Yes.
It's becoming more like a community now.
Yeah, in Jordan, in Lebanon as well. We are talking about Arab countries, as I mentioned previously, Arab countries who have been already in a struggle with their own problems, and now they have an extra pressure on already a very limited resources.
Extra pressure of a new generation coming into the world, not knowing what kind of national identity in terms of governmental papers and ideas will they hold. My final question before we wrap up, I don't know, I mean, correct my very minor piece of information, but the key word in Syria is Damascus. I mean, how far is having Damascus stand firm in its position, playing a very serious role in, keeping Syria as a whole from collapsing completely?
It's a very complicated issue. How to
put
qualify,
Damascus into this
how to
context.
qualify that when Damascus will be out of the equation, or how it will, whether there will be a stand to stop all of this very soon or not. It's very complicated to judge.
Yes, it's very complicated. Unfortunately, as I said, it's always the civilians that are paying the price for it, and I think that's the way they show off the story on 4. Well, God bless all Syrians, of course, and everybody who is stranded away from their homeland. And I would like to thank very much Ms. Yusra El-Sharqawi, the Deputy Head of the Foreign Affairs Desk at Al-Ahram Daily Newspaper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
My
pleasure
having you. And that brings us to the end of our episode of The World Today. I'm Yasmin Bakir signing off. Stay tuned. Shortly, we're going to be going on for a live transmission, as I said, from the UN Security Council in New York.